If you were waiting for someone important to arrive, she already did. The words were not spoken loudly, but they landed in the room a few minutes later with far more weight than anyone expected. At 9:01 a.m. on a bright Tuesday morning in Midtown Manhattan, the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of Sterling Financial Tower looked exactly like the kind of place where billion-dollar decisions were made. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Hudson River. A polished walnut conference table stretched nearly 30 feet across the center of the room. Screens displayed market forecasts and acquisition projections. Every seat was occupied by executives, directors, and investors dressed in tailored suits worth more than most people's monthly rent. Then Monica Reynolds walked in. She arrived alone. No assistants. No security detail. No public relations team. Just a navy blazer, a leather portfolio, and a calm expression that seemed almost out of place in a room built on ego. Monica was 42 years old, the chief executive officer of Reynolds Capital, and one of the most successful financial leaders in the country. Yet nobody entering the room would have guessed it from the way she carried herself. That was intentional. She preferred results to attention. As she approached the conference table, conversations continued around her. Some executives glanced up briefly before returning to their discussions. Others barely noticed her at all. At the far end of the room stood Richard Whitmore, a 58-year-old billionaire investor whose reputation filled every corner of Wall Street. Richard was greeting board members one by one. Firm handshakes, broad smiles, confident jokes. Every interaction seemed carefully rehearsed. Monica reached the table just as Richard finished speaking with another director. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Monica extended her hand politely. The room did not stop moving. Nobody expected anything unusual. Richard looked directly at her hand. Then he looked at her face. A faint smile appeared. Not a friendly one. The kind that existed only to remind someone of their place. Without saying a word, he turned away and greeted the executive standing behind her instead. The silence lasted only a second. Then a few people laughed. Quietly at first. Then more comfortably when Richard chuckled himself. Monica lowered her hand. She did not react. She did not ask for an explanation. She simply took her seat. Somehow that made the moment feel even heavier. Richard adjusted his cufflinks and addressed the room. "Let us focus on people who actually built something," he said casually. Several directors smiled. One laughed openly. Another shook his head as if the comment were harmless. Monica placed her portfolio on the table and opened her notebook. Nothing in her expression changed. Across the room, Ethan Brooks, the youngest director on the board, watched the exchange carefully. Something about Monica's reaction felt unusual. Most people would have looked embarrassed. Others would have become defensive. Monica looked neither. She looked patient. The meeting officially began moments later. Screens illuminated. Presentations opened. Discussion started. Yet beneath the polished professionalism, something had shifted. The room believed it had already identified the most important person present. They believed power was standing at the front beside the presentation screen. What none of them realized was that the quiet woman sitting halfway down the table was not there to impress anyone. She was there to see who they really were when they believed she did not matter. The meeting settled into its rhythm at 9:08 a.m., but the atmosphere around the conference table remained uneven. Richard Whitmore stood near the presentation screen as though he owned not only the agenda but the room itself. Market forecasts glowed behind him. Growth projections stretched across the display in blue and gold. Around the table, directors reviewed reports and exchanged approving nods before Richard had even finished explaining them. Monica Reynolds sat quietly halfway down the table. Her notebook remained open. Her pen moved occasionally across the page. She never interrupted. She never tried to reclaim the moment from earlier. That seemed to confuse people more than if she had argued. Most executives fought to establish their importance. Monica appeared perfectly comfortable letting everyone underestimate hers. Richard advanced another slide. "The next phase of expansion will position us ahead of every major competitor in the region," he said. Several directors immediately agreed. One even complimented the strategy before the details had been fully explained. Monica listened without reacting. Across the room, Ethan Brooks noticed something unusual. While most people were watching the screen, Monica was studying the people around it. Her attention drifted from director to director, as if she were collecting information that had nothing to do with the presentation itself. Ethan found himself wondering what she was looking for. Richard continued speaking. Success comes from decisive leadership, he said confidently, not endless analysis. A few people laughed lightly. The comment sounded general, but everyone understood where it was aimed. Monica simply wrote something in her notebook. Richard noticed and smiled. I hope we are not losing anyone already. More laughter followed. Monica looked up briefly. Not at all, she replied calmly. I am keeping track of the assumptions. The answer was polite, professional, yet something about it caused the laughter to fade more quickly than before. Richard cleared his throat and moved to the next slide. The room continued forward. Financial targets, acquisition opportunities, market penetration forecasts. Each topic received the same treatment. Richard spoke. The board agreed. Monica listened. The pattern repeated until it became impossible not to notice. Then she raised her hand. The room grew unexpectedly quiet. Richard forced a smile. Yes, Monica. Her voice remained steady. What contingency measures exist if projected capital commitments arrive later than expected? Several directors exchanged glances. Richard answered immediately. That is not a concern. Monica nodded. Based on what analysis? Richard's smile tightened slightly. Based on experience. A few directors chuckled. Monica wrote another note. She did not challenge him. She did not debate. She simply documented the answer. Ethan watched carefully. The more Monica spoke, the more he realized she was not participating in the meeting the same way everyone else was. Most people were trying to persuade. Monica was evaluating. The difference felt important. Near the windows, sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers and swept slowly across the conference table. The room looked impressive, powerful, untouchable. Yet beneath the polished surface, something was beginning to shift. Richard believed he was leading a discussion. Monica seemed to be conducting a test, and judging by the calm certainty in her eyes, she already suspected how it would end. By 9:16 a.m., the pattern had become impossible to miss. Every time Monica Reynolds asked a question, Richard Whitmore found a way to turn it into a joke. Every time she pointed toward a potential risk, someone around the table found a reason to dismiss it. The boardroom had slowly transformed into something that felt less like a strategic meeting and more like a performance. Richard stood at the center of it, comfortable in the spotlight. Monica remained seated, calm and observant, watching the room reveal itself one comment at a time. The next slide appeared on the screen. Revenue forecasts stretched across the display in colorful charts and optimistic projections. Richard smiled confidently. As everyone can see, the numbers speak for themselves. Several directors nodded immediately. Monica glanced at the figures. What stress test was used to evaluate downside exposure? The question was straightforward. Professional. Necessary. Richard folded his arms. We are discussing growth, not failure. A few people laughed. Sandra Keller smiled openly. Another director shook his head as though Monica had missed the point entirely. Monica wrote something in her notebook. She never responded to the laughter. Somehow that made it more uncomfortable. Richard clicked to the next slide. The future belongs to people willing to move forward. His eyes drifted briefly toward Monica. Not people looking for reasons to hesitate. More quiet laughter followed. Ethan Brooks watched from across the table. The reactions bothered him now. Earlier, he had assumed Richard was simply being dismissive. Now it felt intentional. Every comment seemed designed to reduce Monica's credibility without directly challenging her expertise. The distinction mattered. Monica raised her eyes from her notebook. Responsible growth requires understanding risk. Richard smiled. And excessive caution creates missed opportunities. The room rewarded the response with approving nods. Monica did not argue. She simply let the statement remain exactly as it was. Ethan noticed something interesting. The less Monica defended herself, the more Richard seemed determined to keep pushing. It was as though her composure irritated him. Near the windows, sunlight reflected against the glass towers outside, filling the room with bright morning light. The setting looked polished and successful. Yet beneath the expensive suits and confident presentations, something less attractive was becoming visible. Assumptions, bias, ego. Monica seemed content to let them surface naturally. Richard advanced another slide focused on capital deployment. This strategy will create extraordinary value for everyone involved. Monica looked up. What percentage of projected funding depends on commitments that have not yet been fully secured? Richard laughed softly before answering. You seem unusually concerned about funding. Several people joined him. Monica nodded once. I am concerned about accuracy. The room quieted briefly. Ethan noticed several directors glance between Monica and Richard. For the first time that morning, a few seemed uncertain about which side of the conversation sounded more reasonable. Richard sensed the shift immediately. His smile tightened. Trust me, he said confidently. The people backing this plan know exactly what they are doing. Monica closed her notebook and rested her hands on the table. Her expression never changed. But Ethan could feel something changing in the room. Richard believed he was winning because people laughed when he spoke. Monica appeared to be measuring something entirely different. And judging by the calm certainty in her eyes, the meeting was moving exactly where she expected it to go. At 9:24 a.m., the meeting should have been moving toward a vote. Instead, it was slowly turning into something else. The presentation continued, but the attention in the room was beginning to drift away from the screen and toward the people sitting around the table. Richard Whitmore did not notice. Or perhaps he noticed and mistook it for admiration. He continued moving confidently through projections and forecasts, speaking with the certainty of someone who had never been challenged for long. Monica Reynolds sat quietly, listening. The notebook in front of her was now filled with short observations. Not about the numbers, about the people. Every assumption, every dismissal, every reaction. Across the room, Ethan Brooks found himself paying less attention to Richard's presentation and more attention to the documents on his tablet. Something about Monica's questions continued bothering him. They were too specific, too targeted. She was not asking random questions. She seemed to know exactly where to look. Ethan opened the funding appendix attached to the proposal. At first he scanned it casually. Then he stopped. A familiar name appeared near the middle of the page. Reynolds Capital Strategic Holdings. He frowned and scrolled farther. The same name appeared again. Then again. His eyes narrowed. The deeper he read, the more frequently the names surfaced. Direct commitments. Supporting commitments. Contingency commitments. The structure was more interconnected than he had realized. Ethan glanced across the table toward Monica. She was listening to Richard with the same calm expression she had worn all morning. No frustration. No urgency. No sign that she felt outnumbered. Richard advanced another slide. The financing structure behind this expansion is exceptionally strong, he declared. Several directors nodded immediately. Sandra Keller smiled. Another executive remarked that the plan looked virtually unstoppable. Ethan returned to the documents. The numbers attached to Reynolds Capital were substantial, larger than he expected, significantly larger. He checked the figures twice to make sure he was reading them correctly. Then a third time. A slow feeling of unease settled over him. Monica had spent nearly the entire meeting asking questions about capital assumptions. Suddenly those questions made much more sense. Richard continued speaking. Every major commitment is secure. Monica looked up briefly. Every commitment. Richard smiled. Every meaningful one. A few people laughed. Monica nodded and made no further comment. Ethan looked from the screen back to the funding schedules. Something felt wrong. Not with the numbers. With the room. The people laughing seemed unaware of information sitting directly in front of them. The presentation was receiving more attention than the actual structure supporting it. Ethan leaned back slightly. For the first time that morning, he wondered whether Monica was not testing the proposal at all. Perhaps she was testing the people presenting it. Near the windows, sunlight reflected across the polished conference table. The room still looked powerful, impressive, certain of itself. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle shift was taking place. Ethan could feel it. The board believed Richard controlled the future being discussed on the screen. The documents in front of him suggested something very different. And as Monica calmly watched the room continue underestimating her, Ethan began to suspect that the most important person at the table was the one nobody seemed interested in listening to. At 9:31 a.m., the meeting had reached the point where confidence began turning into arrogance. Richard Whitmore could feel the room behind him. Every approving nod reinforced his authority. Every laugh encouraged him to push a little further. The presentation continued across the large screen, but the discussion had become increasingly personal. Monica Reynolds remained seated with the same calm posture she had maintained since arriving. The more composed she appeared, the more determined Richard seemed to become. He clicked to a slide outlining future funding priorities. Growth requires vision, he said confidently. Not endless caution from people who have never carried real responsibility. Several directors laughed. The comment was not directed at anyone by name, but everyone understood exactly who it targeted. Monica looked at the slide for a moment before turning her attention back to the room. She did not respond. She did not defend herself. She simply watched. Ethan Brooks noticed the reaction immediately. Or rather, the lack of reaction. It felt deliberate, like someone allowing a conversation to reveal more than the speakers intended. Richard continued. The market rewards courage, not hesitation. More nods followed. Sandra Keller smiled. Another director leaned back comfortably in his chair. The room was moving as one now, following Richard's rhythm without questioning it. Then Monica spoke. What percentage of the projected capital stack depends on external approval triggers? The question was precise. Richard sighed dramatically. You really do enjoy discussing funding. A few people laughed again. Monica remained calm. Funding determines whether plans become reality. Richard shook his head. No, leadership determines that. The room rewarded the answer with another round of approval. Ethan looked down at the funding schedules on his tablet. The numbers continued bothering him. Reynolds Capital appeared everywhere. The deeper he reviewed the commitments, the more difficult it became to understand why nobody else seemed interested in discussing them. Richard moved away from the screen and rested his hands on the conference table. The truth is simple, he said. This company does not need nervous investors slowing down progress. The words hung in the air. Then came the comment that changed everything. Richard smiled toward Monica. We certainly do not need charity money telling experienced operators how to run a business. The laughter arrived quickly, louder than before. Several directors joined in. Others looked away but said nothing. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. Monica lowered her eyes briefly. For a moment, another room appeared in her memory. Another conference table. Another group of executives. She was 24 years old then, presenting an investment proposal that had taken months to prepare. Before she could finish the first slide, someone had asked whether she was there to deliver documents for the meeting. The room had laughed. She remembered the feeling. Not anger. Clarity. The realization that some people decided who mattered before hearing a single word. The memory disappeared as quickly as it came. Monica returned to the present. Richard was still speaking. Still performing. Still collecting approval from people who believed they understood exactly who held power. Monica reached for her phone. The movement was small enough that most people never noticed it. Ethan did. She unlocked the screen, typed a short message, reviewed it once, and pressed send. Then she placed the phone beside her notebook and folded her hands calmly on the table. Nothing happened. No alert. No announcement. The meeting continued exactly as before. Yet Ethan could not shake the feeling that something important had just begun. Because for the first time that morning, Monica Reynolds looked completely finished asking questions. At 9:37 a.m., the meeting continued as if nothing had changed. Richard Whitmore returned to the front of the room and advanced another slide. Growth projections filled the screen. Revenue forecasts stretched across the next 5 years. Around the table, directors reviewed reports and nodded along. On the surface, everything looked normal. Beneath the surface, momentum had already shifted. Monica Reynolds sat quietly with her hands folded beside her notebook. Her phone remained face down on the table. The message she had sent less than 2 minutes earlier had been short, precise, and entirely professional. No emotion, no explanation, just an instruction. Richard continued speaking confidently. Once the vote is completed, implementation begins immediately. Several directors nodded. Sandra Keller smiled. Another executive remarked that the proposal represented one of the strongest opportunities the company had ever pursued. Ethan Brooks looked down at the funding schedules again. The numbers still bothered him. Reynolds Capital appeared repeatedly throughout the structure. Commitments, guarantees, strategic support. Entire sections of the expansion plan seemed connected to capital sources linked directly or indirectly to Monica's organization. The deeper he reviewed the documents, the less comfortable he became. Finally, Ethan raised his hand. Richard paused. Yes. Ethan chose his words carefully. I have a question regarding funding concentration. Several directors looked up. Monica remained silent. Richard offered a confident smile. There is no meaningful concentration risk. Ethan glanced down at the figures. The documentation suggests otherwise. The room grew noticeably quieter. Richard folded his arms. Our finance teams have already reviewed the structure. Ethan nodded. I understand. But several commitments appear connected through the same capital network. Richard's expression tightened slightly. Only for a moment. Then he smiled again. You are overthinking it. A few directors laughed softly. Ethan did not. Across the table, Monica watched the exchange calmly. She looked neither surprised nor concerned. She simply observed. Then a notification sound echoed somewhere in the room. A soft chime. Then another. And another. Several directors glanced down at their tablets. A few reached for their phones. Richard frowned. Sandra unlocked her device. Another executive opened his email. Conversation stopped. Eyes moved across screens. Confusion began replacing confidence. Monica never touched her phone. She already knew what the message contained. Ethan opened the email and immediately sat straighter in his chair. The subject line was brief. Funding review notice. Silence spread through the boardroom. Directors reread the message. Some adjusted their glasses. Others scrolled slowly through the details. Richard looked around the room. What is it? Nobody answered immediately. The presentation screen continued glowing behind him, suddenly irrelevant. Richard finally opened the email himself. As he read, the confidence that had carried him through the entire morning seemed to pause. The room felt different now. Smaller. Heavier. Sandra lowered her tablet slowly. Another director exchanged a worried glance with a colleague. Monica remained perfectly still. The email did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It did not make threats. It simply announced that key funding commitments connected to the expansion strategy had entered immediate review status, pending further evaluation. Professional language. Enormous consequences. Richard looked up from his screen. For the first time all morning, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Across the table, Monica Reynolds met his gaze calmly. The test she had been conducting since she entered the room was almost over. The results were beginning to arrive. The silence inside the boardroom deepened at 9:42 a.m. What had begun as confusion was quickly becoming realization. Directors continued staring at their screens, rereading the same email as though the wording might change. It did not. The message remained exactly what it appeared to be. A formal review of critical funding commitments connected to the expansion strategy. No accusations. No dramatic language. Just a process. Yet everyone in the room understood that processes involving billions of dollars had consequences. Richard Whitmore lowered his tablet slowly and looked toward Monica Reynolds. For the first time that morning, he was no longer speaking to her as though she were an outsider. Did you know this was coming? He asked. Monica met his gaze calmly. Yes. The answer landed heavily. Several directors looked up immediately. Richard straightened his posture. How? Monica folded her hands on the table. Because I requested it. The room became completely still. Even the faint sounds of traffic from 40 stories below seemed distant. Sandra Keller looked from Monica to the email and back again. Ethan Brooks remained silent, but he could feel the atmosphere changing around him. Earlier that morning, people had laughed when Monica spoke. Now nobody wanted to interrupt a single word. Richard forced a small smile. You requested a review? Monica nodded. After listening to the assumptions presented today, yes. Richard shook his head. That is an extraordinary response to a simple disagreement. Monica's expression remained unchanged. This was never about disagreement. Her voice was calm, measured, and impossible to ignore. It was about confidence. Richard opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Around the table, directors were already reopening financial documents. Numbers that had seemed secondary an hour earlier were suddenly receiving very careful attention. Monica stood slowly. No dramatic movement. No attempt to command the room. Yet every eye followed her. The room had spent the morning deciding who mattered. Now it was being forced to reconsider. Monica looked around the table. For nearly an hour, I have listened while concerns were dismissed, assumptions went unquestioned, and critical risks were treated as inconveniences. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked away. More importantly, she continued, I listened while people made judgments before understanding the facts. Richard crossed his arms. You are speaking as though you control the outcome. Monica turned toward him. The sunlight behind her reflected across the glass walls, casting long patterns over the conference table. No, she said quietly. I am speaking as someone who understands the structure behind it. Ethan noticed directors scrolling rapidly through funding schedules. The pieces were beginning to connect. Reynolds Capital, strategic commitments, support guarantees, long-term backing. The same name appeared repeatedly. Sandra's eyes widened as she reviewed the figures again. Monica continued, "You laughed because you thought I needed approval from this room." The words were not delivered with anger. They did not need to be. You assumed influence belonged to the loudest voice at the table. Richard's expression tightened. Monica looked directly at him. "You never realized this table was built on support connected to my firm." Silence followed. Then she delivered the statement that changed everything. Reynolds Capital currently controls more than $3 billion in strategic commitments attached to this expansion. The room froze. No one moved. No one spoke. The presentation screen behind Richard continued glowing with forecasts and projections that suddenly seemed meaningless. Because in a single moment, the woman they had spent the morning underestimating had revealed the truth. She was not sitting at the table because she needed the deal. The deal needed her. The boardroom remained frozen at 9:47 a.m. The words had already been spoken, yet their impact continued spreading through the room like a slow-moving shockwave. $3 billion. The number sat silently over the conference table, impossible to ignore and impossible to explain away. Directors who had spent the morning smiling at Richard Whitmore now stared down at their tablets. The funding schedules they had barely glanced at earlier suddenly became the most important documents in front of them. Sandra Keller reopened the financial appendix and reviewed it line by line. Another director adjusted his glasses and read the commitment structures again. The numbers did not change. The reality did not change. Reynolds Capital was woven throughout the expansion plan in ways few people had fully appreciated. Richard remained standing near the presentation screen. For the first time that morning, he looked disconnected from the room around him. The confidence that had carried him through every slide, every joke, and every dismissal was beginning to disappear. "There must be alternatives," he said finally. Monica Reynolds looked at him calmly. "There are always alternatives." The answer offered no comfort. Ethan Brooks watched the room carefully. Earlier, every conversation had revolved around Richard. Every decision seemed to move through him. Now nobody was looking in his direction for leadership. They were looking at Monica. Not because she demanded attention. Because she had become impossible to ignore. Sandra lowered her tablet. "How much of the expansion depends on Reynolds Capital support?" Monica did not answer immediately. She allowed the question to settle. Enough that a review cannot be treated as a formality. The room became quiet again. One executive leaned back slowly in his chair. Another rubbed his forehead. The scale of the situation was becoming clearer with every passing minute. Richard shook his head. "This is an overreaction." Monica met his gaze. "A review is not an overreaction. It is due diligence." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. The problem was obvious now. Every warning Monica had raised earlier had been dismissed. Every question had been treated as an inconvenience. Now the very concerns she had tried to discuss were sitting at the center of the room, demanding attention. Ethan looked around the table. No one was laughing anymore. The presentation screen still displayed growth forecasts and expansion projections, but nobody cared about them now. Those numbers belonged to a future that suddenly looked uncertain. Monica remained composed. She did not celebrate. She did not criticize anyone. She simply allowed the facts to exist. That restraint made the moment even more powerful. Richard had spent the morning trying to establish authority. Monica had spent the morning observing. In the end, only one approach survived contact with reality. The sunlight outside continued reflecting across the Manhattan skyline. Ferries moved across the river. Traffic flowed through the streets below. The city remained unchanged. Inside the boardroom, however, everything had shifted. Because the people who had measured influence by volume and appearances had finally discovered something far more important. The strongest position in the room had never belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the person who understood the foundation beneath the entire deal. And that foundation had just reminded everyone exactly who built it. At 9:54 a.m., the meeting was still technically in session, but nobody in the room believed they were discussing the future anymore. They were trying to understand the present. The presentation remained frozen on the screen behind Richard Whitmore, its forecasts and projections now little more than background scenery. Around the conference table, directors sat quietly with open tablets, and unread notes. The energy that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place sat something far less comfortable. Reflection. Monica Reynolds gathered her notebook and closed it gently. The simple sound seemed louder than it should have. Every eye followed her. Richard noticed it too. The room that had spent the morning following his lead was no longer looking to him for answers. Finally, he cleared his throat. Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. The request hung in the air. Several directors immediately understood what he was attempting. A private conversation could reshape the narrative. It could reduce the audience. It could create distance between the morning's actions and their consequences. Monica looked at him calmly. No, the answer was respectful. Firm. Final. Richard shifted uncomfortably. I believe that would be best for everyone involved. Monica slid her tablet into her portfolio. That assumption seems to be the source of several problems today. Nobody laughed. Nobody came to Richard's defense. The silence itself felt like an answer. Ethan Brooks watched carefully. What struck him most was not Monica's power. It was her restraint. She had never raised her voice. She had never demanded respect. She had never reminded anyone of her accomplishments. She had simply allowed people to reveal how they treated someone they believed did not matter. Sandra Keller finally spoke. What happens now? Monica paused beside her chair. Sunlight reflected across the glass walls behind her, casting the Manhattan skyline in gold and silver. Now the review proceeds, she said. The numbers will be examined. The assumptions will be tested. The facts will decide the outcome. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. It was a small movement, but everyone noticed. Earlier that morning, he had dismissed her concerns. He had dismissed her questions. Most of all, he had dismissed her. Now the room understood the cost of that mistake. Monica looked around the table one last time. Her gaze moved from director to director. There was no anger in it. No satisfaction. Only clarity. The problem was never disagreement, she said. Healthy disagreement improves decisions. The room remained silent. The problem was deciding whose voice deserved respect before hearing what they had to say. No one challenged the statement because everyone knew exactly what she meant. Monica turned toward the door. Then she stopped. For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. I did not come here to prove my value, she said quietly. I came here to evaluate yours. The words settled across the boardroom like a final verdict. Then she offered one last glance toward the conference table. I did not raise my voice today. I raised the standard. With that, she walked toward the exit. The door closed softly behind her. No applause followed. None was needed. Outside, New York continued moving exactly as it always had. Traffic flowed through the streets below. Sunlight reflected from glass towers stretching toward the sky. But inside the boardroom, something had changed permanently. Because every person in that room had learned the same lesson. Influence is not always the loudest voice. Leadership is not always the most visible title. And respect, once withheld without reason, can become the most expensive mistake of all.